Gena, welcome to the podcast.
So happy to be here, Jason.
All right. So it's your fault. You sent me down a rabbit hole. I'll tell the audience, we had coffee, a couple months ago.
Something like that.
And this was after, you were on Infinite Loops, Jim O'Shaughnessy's podcast, reached out. We realized, of course, we were in the same city, which, of course, then even farther, we had met, 6 months ago, at a Jason Crawford event, and so many small, webs that connect
intersections,
everybody.
And indeed,
and
a small incestuous world.
It really is.
That we live
in. And then we were just talking about like this episode. We wanted to come on, talk, and then we ended up talking about agency. And then in like the 2 or 3 months since that conversation, it's come up so many times in my life.
This is awesome.
Both just in random conversations. I was with a VC and we were just talking, and it was the conversation of agency and awe. Then I was on the Gen Bio podcast with Taylor Capito, which is going to come out in January, where we were talking about the idea of the problem being that healthcare is never invisible. Like a lot of technology becomes invisible. Like, our phones just work, different things just work, but healthcare is always so energetic. You always have to work at it in some different way. And then we got into this idea of, can AI agents actually do things to create a new level of agency? The example we get into was like, hey, my AI agent is going to go out to the restaurant ahead of time, and I'm allergic to XYZ, and it never appears on the menu.
So good.
Or I
await that.
Or I'm a paleo diet, or I'm a carnivore diet, or whatever. And just so
like the how things much can we automate of our own, of what now falls on our own conscious self-regulation.
Right. But this point it being, but the switch being, and then it was like, Brendan McCord was on, Joe Lonsdale's podcast and talking about how agency, all the AI is coming at us. And then we were thinking about flipping, and then I was talking, I was at a birthday party with them, like, can you flip it around and have the AI work for you, and instead increasing your agency. Yeah. So I blame you for me going down this rabbit hole.
I so eagerly accept that blame. And by the way, I might even get to multiply the blame, because I also spoke to Brendan McCord probably some weeks prior to that interview he did. So chances are that I've been incepting these ideas in all of your heads, and now I'm just getting to enjoy the fruits of my labors. This is awesome.
So, one thing I want to start back on, and I think this is where we almost started the conversation when we were having coffee, and this is this is the argument you and I keep having, so let's have it now, is how do we define agency? And I think we want to step back, because I think the crux of the argument is agency defined by the mere act of choice, or is it choice multiplied by the impact of action? Like, do you have to have, is it one, or do you have to have both to have agency?
Yeah. So as you know, and just to complicate things, I see it
as simple, please.
Well, you'll have to help me with that. I'll try. I'll get as simple as I can get currently with my definition, and then maybe you can help me simplify it a bit more. Good luck to us. So my current understanding is that it is a mindset. It's an internalized mindset about the relationship in which we stand to the world, such that we see problems as solvable by us, such that we see ourselves as capable of, and we see it as our charter. We see it as our right and our imperative to shape the world according to our values and our needs. And that goes all the way to, which includes the choosing of values in the first place, that our life is ours to live, that it's our building project, and we see ourselves as the authors of that life. And I think that intersects the two things you said. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, okay. I actually really like that definition, but I think it doesn't intersect. I think it fits more on the side of where I have the definition, which it's purely on the mindset and the act of choice, so that you have agency, if you have the mindset of making choice, even if your level of ability to actually mold and shape the world is small or large.
Good. Okay. So I think you're mostly right. And I think this cuts to the heart of what I mean by a mindset, in that I don't think that we can have a mindset in a purely disembodied way. Like if someone says, I believe that it's important to restrict calories in order to live a healthy life, but what you actually see in practice is that they just shovel sweets into their mouth indiscriminately and don't seem terribly bothered by it. Like I wouldn't actually say they have a belief about
Sure.
the need
I agree with
to
that.
restrict calories or whatever. And similarly, if someone says that they believe that they are the authors of their lives and that they both can and need to, ought to make choices that promote the life of promote their best lived life, or fully lived life, and what you actually see is that they're kind of just passively going with the flow and acting out whatever the motions that have been prescribed for them, and mostly on autopilot and cowed by fear or external pressure. I wouldn't say they actually have the mindset. Does that make sense? So I would need to see
That makes a lot of
something in
sense.
action
Yeah.
that suggests, oh, they are actually taking charge of their lives. They're actually making choices in practice that reshape their world to their liking, etc.
Yeah, no, I would 100% agree with that. I think it's the problem I have is where I see people associate agency with only the ability to make like huge change beyond themselves. Like I'm going to take an extreme example. Only Elon Musk has agency because he
Yeah,
can,
I
change.
don't think that's
That's
right.
the point. You're putting like if they are saying back to your original, sweets are bad, I shouldn't have them, and then I constantly consume them. Then yes, I agree. Then the point is, well, you don't have agency. You're saying words but
Mm-hmm.
not doing anything, not actually making choices, then no, then you're not. You're on the rails. You're not.
That's
You're
right.
black. You actually you're. It's almost worse in some cases. I don't know what the if you want to say like if NPC is worse, if agency and NPC for lack of if that's our
Mm-hmm.
two ends.
Hmm.
But and it's almost worse than a mindless because you're like this is what I should be doing because it's
Yeah, and I mean, you'll find a lot of NPCs who will, in fact, parrot these kinds of statements, right? They'll
but
literally
there's an
say,
interesting there's almost three three types, right? There's the I'm making individual choices and acting upon them.
mm-hmm,
There's I'm being I'd say the true nature of the NPC, which is like everything outside is essentially making the choices for me,
mm-hmm,
and I'm acting those choices. And there's almost this middle
mm-hmm.
one, which you just said, which is like sweets are bad and
Yeah,
I
where
shouldn't
there's a
have them,
cognitive
and then I'm
dissonance,
eating them, right? Like
right?
that's
Yeah.
almost the worst scenario, which is like I'm not even I'm parroting one thing and acting the opposite.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple of different scenarios where you might hear someone saying one thing while doing another, and I think some are more innocuous among those scenarios than others, where we can be conflicted, and we often are, right? If we've committed to some new approach, or so, okay, I really want to mind my fitness, and so I'm going to start this exercise program, or I
That's the learning curve part of it, right?
yeah,
Right.
that's right.
That's just it's
Yeah,
hard.
and we'll often slip, and we'll often, and for any given belief or any given like commitment or perspective we take on, there's a learning curve is a good way to describe it, but even just cognitively, epistemically, there's a process by which we need to internalize it. It's not going to be fully ours the first time that we sort of encounter it and decide that it's plausible and that maybe we should try it on for size, right? Like there's a process of gathering evidence from the world and acting on it, and thereby gaining further conviction that, oh yeah, this really does get borne out in practice, and sort of getting emotional purchase with the belief. So, and someone can be fully high agency and still need to go through that process with any given commitment or approach.
Right. It's like I don't know what the name of the framework is, but it's the I think this is more of a learning framework, which is like you're unaware and unable, and then aware and
That's right.
unable, and then aware and able, and then unaware and able. Right.
That's right.
That's
Yeah, the
the
automatization kind of
right.
continuum, which in psychology there's a stages of change model that also describes roughly that. Yes, but
Yeah,
same idea.
and so you have that, and then obviously the same thing with a belief system an idea as you kind of understand it versus the riding the rails kind of mentality, and then as I
Rails
think
that you didn't build, right? In a
right,
direction you didn't choose. Yeah.
yeah, and then I think,
Exact.
but part of and then how much and it's funny because I was through this whole kind of rabbit hole that I've been going down. I've been so I'm going to almost play devil advocate to what I've been arguing. It's all I've been about like agency. At the same time, part of the argument about the creating the invisible nature of certain technology is because your statement about the rails you didn't build is almost that is okay because great, these rails I didn't build, they work. So I can ride them in a certain way. Now, there's a difference between ideological rails and technological rails.
Yes. And I mean, that right there, I think, is
Right.
the crucial distinction, because I definitely do not subscribe to the view like you have to live on a desert island and, cook and what is the verb for doing agriculture? Plant and cultivate all of your own food and farm, for heaven's sake. See, I don't even remember the word, much less know how to do the deed. Anyway, I'm all in favor of a specialized society where we have division of labor. So it's very much not that you have to build all the rails.
Adam Smith wrote a book about this.
Sense.
That
He did.
Yes.
Yeah, there have been some good minds on this. But I think at an epistemic level, you sort of have to build or rebuild the rails in the sense that, of course, we learn so many of our ideas, right? We get so much of our knowledge from other people. We benefit from all of the giants who stood before us and have come to understand everything, from like math and science, right, to how do we read and write, and what are the best practices for starting a company, and the rest of it. But we need to make it our own by actually following the line of thought through and reconstructing the understanding for ourselves, right? And so, yeah, you're right. When I say someone's riding a rail they didn't build, what I mean is that they don't know why that rail is there or where it's leading, right? They haven't signed on to it. They haven't endorsed it. They haven't made it their own.
Well, yeah, and we both have young kids, and I've recently had a bunch of education episodes just as they've kind of come up, and especially as they've been oriented around AI, because I think the skill set has a lot been changing because, you and I grew up, we had to know dates, we had to know, pre mobile phones and all these kinds of things. And then, as our kids, my kids are always like, oh, well, I want the answer, these obscure answers, but they know the answer is always in the pocket, right?
Yeah.
And then
a computer robot.
Right. Well, now they're asking like, well, can I just ask ChatGPT? Like they're asking for it. And I will never forget. I was listening to Invest with the Best, Patrick O'Shaughnessy's podcast. And it's just a great moment because I think he's got kids somewhere around like my kid's age, and I guess he was telling his daughter he's like, you got to Google this, and she's like, that's not a real thing.
Wow.
And like that just stuck with me. And I had to tell my 11-year-old that because he was doing a project that he was not allowed to use ChatGPT for the research because I think they were afraid of like hallucinations. They wanted the direct sources.
Sure.
Of course, he was having all sorts of problems with Google because it's not designed for the way that he asks questions now.
It doesn't talk back to him in full sentences.
And I think also the people who design this don't know what Perplexity is, because Perplexity obviously is designed now to do searches, give sources, so he can actually do the things. Or even now ChatGPT search exists, so he can. Yeah. The problems that they envisioned and set in stone don't exist anymore.
That's so wild.
versus like, no, the
Yeah.
little blue links. And now I can't even use Google for anything because I'm like, well, this is not what I want. 'Cause I remember he's like, I want to know like, what's the cheapest way to make basalt? Like, that's not a question that you can ask Google.
No, certainly
But
not
you can ask
with
any
AI.
of the AIs this question.
That's right. That's so crazy. It's just so funny to me that I remember when Google became a verb. Like,
Yes.
and I remember being so struck by that. Oh my gosh, like we have this new verb for this new type of thing we can do where we Google things, and like that being a really big innovation. And now it's no longer going to be a verb. Like, it will be forgotten.
Yeah.
History.
But so then the whole point is, so we had to know information. And then as we kind of, and so forth, then it was about, okay, all the information's out there and gettable in some format. I mean, I remember, look, I was doing a project early in my career where I had to know hospital bed counts, like by year in this, and it was painful to get this information. And now I'm like, it'd probably take me 10 seconds to do.
Yep.
And even in the case of
incredible.
whether it was right or wrong, the point was relative answer, right? Like getting it down to the actual bed.
Yeah.
So the skill set is changing. I was just writing this the other day. Like it's not so the analysis and computation isn't the skills anymore. It's the creativity. It's the questions. It's how do you put these things together that becomes a very different skill set, right? I had on, Austin Allred about he's created this Gauntlet AI and they're creating these new AI engineers. It's like, well, in 12, like, what do you teach these people? Like, you're obviously not teaching them to code. Like, it's a different set of skills you're trying to teach them to be able to build products. And it was about mindset. It was about technology. It was about the tool sets and how do you build these kind of new tool sets.
I mean, so it's interesting to think about the ways the skill set does and doesn't change. And I don't think I have a really clear-headed understanding of this yet, if anybody does. My husband, Matt, who's an educator and philosopher of pedagogy and has been really at the forefront of thinking about these things, he'd probably have much more of a take. I think he would probably say, and I can mostly reconstruct the reasons why, that we absolutely do still want to teach coding, just as we still want to teach arithmetic and various other kind of like fundamental building block kinds of skills to kids, even if they're never going to, quote, end up doing it or need to do it manually. We've been teaching arithmetic since long after calculators came about, right? And I think there are epistemic reasons for that, in that we need to be able to understand, again, as we were saying earlier about needing to be able to kind of reconstruct the rail, even if you didn't build it. I think for us to be able to competently function in the world and understand like what we're doing when we're calculating a tip at the restaurant, and what it means that something is a fraction of something, and what it means that and to be able to sort of understand relative volumes or quantities, of whether it's cash or whether it's building blocks or whatever. Like, I don't think the epistemic need to understand a lot of those things goes away, and it might even become more crucial. Like, for us to code, to have enough fluency in coding to be able to understand a bit of what we're asking the AI to do, and what kinds of bugs might arise, and kind of what's happening under the hood. So I just think there are really interesting questions around how does our skill set actually change, and what do we not need to do or to learn anymore, and what do we?
Well, I mean, to your point, we're teaching arithmetic, but do we need to teach? Do we need to teach calculus? Right?
Good question.
Like, what comes down, and like, do you get to the arithmetic faster, and then introduce, okay, now the AI I'm making it up, in first grade, so that okay, whatever question you want to ask, you can ask. I mean, all math. Once you understand the basic idea of math and what it is, and that numbers are infinite, and that these are the basic structures of how they go together.
Yeah, that's a great question.
You can start asking these broader questions of how these things go together. Because I mean, I can't do. I happen to hit like third semester calculus I took it twice. That is the limit of my mathematical ability.
Yep.
But there is probably, because of AI, math available to me now, and questions available to me that weren't available before.
And it's awesome, right, that it is. Yeah, I mean, I think if I had to guess, and I don't know for sure, if I had to guess about calculus, probably calculus becomes more disposable as like a firsthand skill set, because you do have access to tools that automate a lot of that process for you and that allow you to get answers much faster. Though I don't know for sure, because I don't even remember calculus myself well enough to kind of really engage with like, what are the generalizable intuitions about the world that it gave me that I wouldn't have others. But like algebra, I would have strong priors that, yeah, we still need algebra, at least, because with algebra, we get this generalized understanding that the world is made up of, varying of variables, right? And those variables have relationships to each other, and that we can abstract away the particular item, or the particular quantity, and still think about relationships among
But see,
variables.
I think it's funny because I think the way you described algebra, and I'm thinking about like calculus, I still couldn't do derivatives and integrals very well, but the idea of derivatives, the idea that acceleration is the first derivative, the first derivative of speed, those ideas are important. But we spend so much time in algebra and calculus on the calculation versus how much time do we spend on the abstraction that you just said in algebra? Almost
probably
none.
Less than we should.
Right.
Although, I mean, thinking about this as a Montessorian, my guess is that with
that's
algebra,
not how, by the way, Montessorian is not how we teach 99.9% of people.
It's definitely, I know it. Yeah. And, there's a small group of people trying to figure out just how to teach the, grade, 4 on up material in a kind of Montessori aligned way. But if I think about algebra, how would Montessori teach algebra if she had developed materials and, methodology up to that level? And when I think about the Montessori approach to numeracy at a more basic level, right? The Montessori approach to literacy, and the extent to which you really do get the abstraction bottom up by engaging with the materials, right? And by seeing the pattern emerge through your very concrete goal-directed efforts to, get this bead to fit onto its place, and to notice how these 5 beads add up to one of these, squares that then is actually the same quantity as 5 of these. And you get this very concrete visual proof at each step of the way. And that is actually how you derive the abstractions, right? And of course, things change when you're a middle schooler versus we do this with 5-year-olds. And so with 5-year-olds, we're not going to talk about the abstractions. We're just going to let them implicitly induce those abstractions from the materials. But yeah, when we get to algebra, there's a lot more conceptual and abstract capacity to work with. But still, I don't think we would want to just throw the abstraction at them. I think we would need them to do some of the calculations to then see the pattern, and then we could name it much faster. Like, notice the pattern here. Notice what's happening.
I think I'll never forget this though. So I was an econ minor, and I remember this was in, I think my first upper division microeconomics class, and we are taking, we're in like one of the study sessions, and the person is going through the entire like supply demand, calculus like proof. And I remember someone raised their hand at one point going like, but what's going on? Like,
yeah,
it's back to the point of there. So much of education is there's this assumed understanding of the abstraction rather than the actual teaching of it. Of like,
well, I mean, I would question:
if you just do all the math, you'll understand the abstract. Like, no, you forgot to teach the abstraction.
You never actually taught the freaking abstraction. I mean, honestly, I might actually be less charitable to at least a lot of the educators involved, not necessarily all, but like, is it that they assume an understanding of the abstraction, or is it that they don't fully understand it themselves and have forgotten that there's even an abstraction to be formed? Which is unfortunate.
No. And that's where I think that some of these levels of where I think some of the AI becomes really interesting, and both as a tool set for educating like kids and the I've talked about it on the podcast a number of times. But I think it's like one of the things that, you know, for my oldest, we were doing is we were talking about like a coffee shop. We were like sitting at Starbucks, and it was like, where would you build a coffee shop? And from there, and like when we grew up, you remember the lemonade stand like video game, right? And like you had like such a narrow band of things that you could do. And then so I went home and I'm like in ChatGPT, I created a coffee shop game, but it was
Nice.
essentially because
Wow,
of
that's
it
so
was
cool.
unlimited, right? He could do anything in it because it was an LLM, and its course was like he put it in a startup, which in the case he made it was NVIDIA. And then he could create any
Wow,
menu item that he wanted. He could create, you know,
that's
sales. He could
so
create this.
awesome.
And then, of course, the joke was then he went all the way to the end, which is that it was worth more. So then he had the coffee shop buy NVIDIA, and it made artificial coffee
Yes,
intelligence and took over the world because he was
that's
10 at the time.
amazing.
And it was fun, right?
It's way
Um,
farther than my almost 5-year-old could get. But
right.
one day I can just see it. That's so
Yeah, and so
cool.
like that was the, you know, because it was you couldn't do like the boundaries are open ended in these things, but then it did teach you, there was an interesting lesson in there, an actual business,
Yeah,
because after 1 week he replaced half the baristas with robots because he understood the cost of labor. He was like,
nice.
oh
This
man,
is
they're expensive,
amazing. I
you
mean, look,
know.
I'm playing Factorio now with a long developmental delay. Have you played or
No,
encountered this game? Oh, well, I'm about to change your world. So I only recently learned about it through, again, my husband, who's much more of like an internet / tech nerd, dating much farther back than I am. And so there's this game Factorio that some subset of internet tech nerds play or played at one point in their lives. The video game. Well, it's a, you know, whatever, computer game.
yeah,
And it's, but those who know it will sometimes jest, but it's only partly in jest, that it's the closest thing to building a startup without actually going and building one. You have to build a factory in order to ultimately build a spaceship that will save you, that will allow you to leave this island you've been stranded on. That's kind of the
okay,
basic conceit. And in building this factory, you have to figure out all the logistics and all the automation involved in, you know, going from just the raw materials on the island. There's iron ore and there's copper and there's you know, there's just wood from trees that you chop down. And
the boys are playing something called Planet Crafter right now, which is they're
speaking
trying to
of,
terraform a planet by doing
that's
all the
awesome.
things that you just said.
Exhibit A or B. Yep.
Yeah.
Classic. Exactly. So, I mean, but this game has taught me, I've just played, I don't know, maybe 10 hours of it so far, which distributed over many days, to be clear. And it's taught me more about the logistical, you know, like what a COO's job actually consists of. And even pre hiring a COO for your startup, like the challenge that my founder clients face day to day in first creating processes to ensure that they actually meet their deadlines for whatever their deliverables to, you know, customers, while also getting the amount that, you know, like having equipment in stock and thinking through kind of like the high output management like methodology, you know, the classic Andy Gross book, but in practice, which I didn't fully understand. Like I realized playing Factorio, yeah, I didn't actually get it when I read the book because I wasn't actually trying to do it. I didn't actually have to like stall in making these red science packs over here while I went to get more electricity from my steam engine like generator over here, and realize, oh shoot, I should have 3 more of these power plants because that's how much energy I'm going to need in order to power my factory up here. Like you only really learn by doing. But how cool is it I can do this by sitting at my computer? But to your earlier point, like of just how much learning and how much faster, you know, the learning that it empowers.
It does. It is interesting though. Like you find, I think if you look back at different people and the types of fiction, the types of games that resonated with them that were young, because I didn't like SimCity. I didn't like that game actually never, even the game that you're talking about didn't necessarily appeal to me. So when I was a
Yeah.
kid, I loved, even today, it's like the Sierra Online games, the King's Quest, the Space Quest, the game, like those are the games I love, like the immersive storytelling.
Yeah.
And even like in the puzzles, it was more of a, solving not necessarily like the operations side of it, which is always makes sense. I think then why I've been more attracted to the more narrative types of roles, strategy, building out those kinds of things than necessarily I always ran screaming from product jobs. I was like, I didn't like
I mean,
that
same.
wasn't me, right?
Yeah,
I wasn't
I'm
the
not
operator.
Totally. I mean, if I played video games for real at all, I would very much err on the side of the narrative, like kind of immersive, character building kind of.
Right. But then I wasn't,
sure.
it wasn't I wasn't I wonder if you kind of line those things up and you see the archetypes of the stories, like you
Ooh.
could kind of build those things up and say like, this is the kind of games, this is the kind of, there's certain things that you could say there are stories that resonate. Like I always ask, I was going back and watching, the full 12 hours Lord of the Rings. One of the things that's been fun, one of the fun things about having children is you get to relive a lot of these kind of past
and reread.
Yes. And so we've been going through all these kind of really, classics, and we did the full Lord of the Rings. And I remember and know that some of the stuff of our current technology and companies were named after things. I didn't quite remember how much of it. I was like, oh yeah, that's named after this. That's named after
so
this.
Cool. Talk about like, it's like extending the immortality of Tolkien and of his world and of his imagination even farther.
But you realize that there's a resonancy there. Like you're asking, like, why did that resonate? And it was more of it was that, did it resonate with a certain person, or was it that it inspired? Like, where's the loop coming from? So there's
no
that
doubt bidirectional,
right? Same thing, like what Asimov was one of those things. But then you also wonder if you can go back to the video games. Like, is it the types of videos? Like, are the people who are more attracted to the narratively driven versus like the action driven versus the civilization world building, factor? Like, is that like, is your founder type this type? Is your investor type this type? I don't know.
That's such a fun question to think about. I mean, I think in answering that question, we would find the blueprints for how self-creation occurs.
It's simple, right?
How we build ourselves. Yes, talk about simple. We'll just boil this right down. But I mean, there's so many different directions just related to this question that I'm tempted to go into. You're going to have to play the restrainer here. But first of all, I mean, I often have clients who are struggling with their agency, who are really trying to open up new doors for themselves and come to see more paths as accessible, as within their reach. And maybe they're dealing with a lot of anxiety, social anxiety or panic, or kind of just this generalized self-doubt, imposter syndrome, et cetera. And when in particular, if they're also depressed, I used to work with a lot more kind of patients with fairly serious and wide-ranging mental health issues. Now, I work more with founders, but which are not necessarily a non-overlapping group. But anyway, when I worked with more kind of seriously, functionally impaired patients, often, I would be looking for that inroads to their sense of agency. I would be looking to spark some life. Like there was even a supervisor of mine once who I remember used this term, like spark of life. You're looking for the spark. And that very much described what was salient to me in working with these patients, where I would be kind of scanning for, okay, when have you, like, tell me about a really happy moment in your childhood. Tell me about, like, when have you been just like most alive? What is a moment you wouldn't take back? What were you doing? And oftentimes patients will tell me with a sense of shame, like, honestly, it's just video games. I've just played a lot of video games. And it's like, there's a cultural discounting that happens. We have this, I think, stigma against, what, you're just sitting on your computer playing video games. That's just so lame. Like, that's, and I think, like it's secondary to actually being out doing things, for sure. Right. And I want for my kids to be out doing things and not just ever simulating, right, reality and the building process. But I can learn so much often from just asking them questions about, well, which video games? And what did you like about that particular game? Like, why this game and not that one? Like, exactly what you're talking about. Like, oh, interesting. You really like games where like you are building an avatar and like a lot of what you actually do in the game is customize that personality versus, oh yeah, like you really like to lay out a terrain. You like to design a space. You like to solve these logistical problems, or you really like multiplayer games where like you're kind of collaborating with someone who has complementary skill sets. Like what do we learn about you and what you actually love doing and might love doing in the real world from which games resonate with you and for what reasons?
I think there's so much available to. I think this is. We'll put the privacy thing, a pin in it for a second, but when you have the ability to go back and look at all this stuff, I think when so much of it is like you have libraries of data, right, and this kind of thing, and one of the things that I've done, and you and I talked about this, and it was with your podcast with Dan Chipper, right, where you were talking about using ChatGPT to go back and kind of almost be like a therapist or doing that. And
or
I was
made it
telling
be
you
my therapist. Yeah.
be your therapist. Yeah. And it was funny because I've been using it a little bit because I'm always one of these, I'm a sucker for when everyone's like, here's this new viral prompt that somebody uses. And it's like this crazy thing. And, do a CIA report and these long prompts and these kind of things. But what was interesting recently. And so like when you have, because of memory or tweets, they have all these kind of this cornucopia of data on you, and it can find different things that are interesting about you. I don't know why most of the prompts tend to be negative to people around. Maybe that's just because what goes viral is always, if it bleeds, it leads. But there was a couple of interesting ones that I thought they went around recently that I just found about me. One was like, it was this really long version of essentially, what's my unspoken fear? Like it was like 3 paragraphs of that.
Yep.
What I found interesting was, so I did it on ChatGPT, so with memory, and I did it on Grok, which just had access to tweets.
Yep.
What I found interesting, I'm not going to say what the answer was here, but I found interesting
was privacy that's at stake.
Right.
Here, so you decide how much you want to disclose.
Was they actually gave the same answer?
That's wild.
So that was interesting. Was all of the prompting. So again, you had everything I was prompting, all the things that I was doing, and then like just the things I'm putting out there in the world gave the same answer. So from one answer, that basically says that I'm essentially very transparent. Like what I put out in the world, what I'm saying to ChatGPT, it's essentially the same thing.
That's a really nice quality. Should double down on that.
But yeah, and then of course,
get along so well.
Like and then of course, at the same time, when I read the innate fear, I was kind of like, it wasn't like
there's some there. Yep,
that wasn't like anything that was that shocking.
By the way, you might find interesting. And then I want to get back to your findings from this exploration, because I know I hear there's going to be a really juicy reveal in those findings. But just a really quick aside that when I was playing around with Dan Chipper, creating different prompts, but also making little chat bots in ChatGPT to support kind of different stages of like the self-reflection process, I built something called a hidden premise finder, one of the bots I built. And I mean, it was a really simple instruction that I gave to the chatbot. It was like, whatever material the user shares, identify and articulate any like hidden beliefs in effect. So it wasn't restricted to fears. It was just like, what might this person believe but not realize they believe? Like, what might they not be fully conscious of? But it's sort of an assumption that's emergent, especially if it has anything to do with like themselves and their self-evaluation, or how they see the world, how they see other people, anything that's sort of evaluative. And it's by far, I just happened to recently click back into that bot and into like the 4 other ones that I had built at that time, which I thought, because they're more comprehensive, they would actually be the ones that get more traction. But there were the highest, I mean, none of these had gone viral, but by any means, and I haven't advertised them at all. It was mostly just for myself.
But you put these ones out there.
Many hundreds of people had conversations with the hidden premise finder. And it's kind of popped up in other random places. Somebody I'd never heard about, got to it and posted about it on LinkedIn, that it actually ended up being really revelatory. So if anyone wants to go try it out.
We'll definitely put that one in the show notes. But yeah, no, actually I was actually just posting about it today because, and then we'll get to the revelatory one, but this was like last year, I created an innovation bot
Ooh.
where I tried to create, it was on the pod about last June or July of 2023, where it was a hive mind of like 20 innovations experts. The starting point of it was, wouldn't I love to talk to ask Clayton Christensen about the whole ChatGPT Google situation? It seems to come right out of it. And I remember Tyler Cowen doing a podcast episode of like talking to Jonathan Swift, like using ChatGPT to do that. And then it was like, well, why am I limiting myself to just Christensen? Why don't we just shove a whole bunch of people in there?
Cool.
And asking that. And then, so like, it was good. And it was interesting because ended up being like 25 different people. And so I ended up interviewing it. I literally just tweeted about this today. It's amazing how clunky it was to do that and then interview it, versus like doing that today would actually be 10 times easier, with things like Notebook LLM.
Yeah.
And, but now I can see uses of, I'd love to do that. And then you want to add in your own work on top of it. So you can like, I want all of their great past from everything from like Christensen to Da Vinci to like Musk, like all these kind of thoughts. But then like, here are my thoughts. But then I want to interact with them. But the problem being is where you like the LLM because it kind of has a baseline of them. But at the same time, like in the best case scenario, you'd be like, well, here's all the source material. I'm just assuming that they all have the correct information on Da Vinci and on, Solo and et cetera. But then you want to be able to talk to it. I know like Notebook LM has some of that stuff, but you kind of see where this is going. And then because one of the big innovation issues I've been trying to get, because I'm really interested in, regional ecosystems and how they work, is we have something called total factor productivity for nations, right? And how they work. But we don't really have a good metric for regional innovation. Like you have really good input metrics like VC funding, number of people, patents, and you have like gross output metrics like GDP, like regional GDP, but nothing that actually, because, so all the input metrics are great, but doesn't necessarily equate to it being innovative, productive.
Yeah, it's like you're not measuring the mechanism.
Right. And then the gross metrics like, increase in employment or increase in GDP, well, that could be scale. Like that doesn't necessarily like product innovation. And at the same time, if you're truly innovative, well, that it may be created locally and then it affects the world globally. So how do you measure that? So that was actually one of the things after I interviewed it, I then was trying to have the chatbot help me kind of come up with something like that. And one of the funniest moments actually is when it became slightly schizophrenic because the hive mind was arguing with itself. It was like, well, this person would say this person would say that.
That's what you hope for, right?
Yes,
like
but it's kind of funny when you have that.
That's amazing. Just as the mental health expert, yada, yada, professional psychologist, I just want to disclaim that that's not actually what schizophrenia is, but it's totally fine to use it in that colloquial way as long as you're not a me.
Yes. I know that is the more colloquial, but I know that's actually not. That's totally dissociative disorder, I think, is the right term.
Maybe. Okay. Yeah, that's closer.
But yes, it was just kind of funny seeing them argue. The other part that was actually a little scary was I used ChatGPT at the time because the way I actually did it structurally is I had ChatGPT. I did a conversation in ChatGPT and then I put it into 11 Labs to record. And then I kind of spliced it all together. Today, we can just do that all in one situation, right?
So cool.
But the funniest thing was when I told it we weren't on the podcast anymore, its tone changed.
Whoa.
So like it knew it was performing.
That's so wild.
So that was kind of a little like, okay, got it. It knows when I'm like being interviewed versus like we're just having a conversation now.
Wow. I mean, now that you say that, my mental model of what is an LLM really keeps evolving. And
this prediction of next token thing like is too overly simplistic. When I see things like this, that I'm like, I get how it works, but you're being overly. That's not quite.
Like there's
something else going
on, or something more, some emergent property of like just doing that at a massive scale.
A lot of these prompts and everything are negative, so I decided to use that same long prompt that was, fears and all that, but I kind of switched it to like, what are your superpowers?
That's right.
But I changed it like a little bit. Like I'm not being vain. Like I want to actually,
it's really,
like give me actually what's useful here.
It's one of the first questions I ask clients, just for the record. So great minds. Like,
interesting.
It's way more informative than any cataloging of our deficits or weaknesses or what have you.
That's good. Yeah. Well, and we always talk about or as we get older, it's about leaning into strengths.
Yeah.
Less about like you mitigate weaknesses, but it's mitigating weaknesses, not getting rid of them. It's like, how do I make them not
and also not make
worry
your life
about
them. Crucially, I have a piece about that. Your flaws matter less than you think. That's like the whole framing of the piece. And
and especially as with startups or building companies, the answer is my flaw. Like you hire, you build a team. Like if I have a flaw, like you find somebody who's a compliment rather than trying to be somebody who's everything.
Exactly.
So what's interesting here is on this side, Grok and ChatGPT actually gave different answers.
Interesting.
And that one, I think the Grok one was more like, you like transparency, you call out BS. I was like, okay, whatever. Like that one, it was less interesting as an answer. It was more of like, you argue on X. Okay, thank you. That's the short version of what I read. It was just like, you argue on X. Okay, I got it.
Yeah, agreed.
What was really interesting to me, though, and I told you, I tell you this because announcement in this is it put a name to something I've been trying to that I hadn't had a name to in this sense. So I told you I've been obsessed with. So I moved from San Diego to Austin, and one of the big questions that I had in that move is, forever San Diego as an ecosystem was using VC funding, was like number 5 without a doubt, like solid. 1 through 4 was always the same, and then 5 stood by itself. 6 through 10 was kind of always in its own light set. Mm-hmm. But if you ever asked anybody, nobody outside of San Diego, and sometimes nobody in San Diego knew that.
Interesting.
And I was always kind of scratching my head going, okay, so San Diego's doing a lot better than anybody realizes, but why doesn't anybody know that? And then Austin, on the other hand, and I would always, when I moved, was always doing a lot better. It was always punching above our weight. Everybody assumed it was actually number 5. And then when I moved here, it was more in the kind of 7, 8, 9. Right. Now at this point, it's actually moved to that kind of that bit. And I was like, okay, so clearly it's more than just the numbers on how you kind of get to that point. It was this rabbit hole I've gone down and a lot, and trying to figure out that there's more to ecosystems, and it's driven me crazy. I hate Silicon XYZ. Yeah. I've written about it, and I say that all the time, right? Because as soon as you're trying to be Silicon XYZ, you're trying to be second best. And the best line that I was telling you this the other day was like the Oscar Wilde quote that just became one of my favorite quotes now, is like, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, which is what everybody hears the quote of, but then you find out that's half the quote, which is imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, that mediocrity pays to greatness.
Nice.
Like, oh, so actually the quote is not a nice quote. It's actually a smack.
Yep. Oh, yeah.
So as soon as you say I'm Silicon,
context is everything. Yep.
Yeah. So as soon as you say I'm Silicon Hills, I'm Silicon Beach, I'm Silicon Slope, I'm Silicon Alley, you're like, oh, maybe I'll be like them the other day.
Maybe I'll be in their
shadow.
If you go,
right. But if you go back in history, there were amazing innovation centers throughout history before Silicon Valley, and there will be ones after. And I'm not saying Silicon Valley's up there with the likes of Florence in Renaissance and all these kind of things. And I think that there is something to innovation ecosystems. It's not just, there was a reason it was Florence. There was there's something to it. So I asked this to it, And it kind of lays out this whole paragraph. Your unspoken superpower is kind of an ecosystem metacognition.
Whoa.
And as soon as it said that, I was like, that's the word I've been looking for forever.
Wow.
Which is also then what I've, since by the time this thing comes out, like I'll have announced that's what I'm calling the Substack.
Ecosystem metacognition?
Metacognition.
Or just metacognition?
Because yes.
Nice.
Because
I'd
that
read that
is
Substack, even knowing nothing else, because it probably along somewhat different tracks, but probably also there's some non-accidental convergence. I've been on about metacognition for decades. Well, I'm so old. But yeah, more in a psychological context.
I know the feeling.
But I'm sure that there's going to be some interesting overlap there.
Well, yeah, because it's the, it's the, and I don't think we'll I don't think we'll have the time in today's podcast to go over my, my persona model of those things.
That's right. Yeah, we'll just really have to do this again.
But it is, because I think about those layers. I mean, some of the ideas I think there are first principles to things. Like the example I always give is first principles to ecosystems. So the example being, if you want to build foundational AI, you should probably be in San Francisco. If you want to build, the next CAR-T or the next small molecule, you should probably be in Boston. Or there was an example where I was on, Craig Cummings from Moonshot Capital was on here. And I don't mean this in a negative way when he was saying the story. Like he was talking about, like, yeah, these guys from, guys from New York came here from New York, and they did, they were, what's in it for me? And they were very transactional and all this kind of stuff, very New Yorky. And it's like, it doesn't work. And I was like, well, hold on. It doesn't work here.
Yeah.
But when you think about the very transactional nature of New York, that you mean the deal-making culture, you mean nowhere else that can be Wall Street. And if you think about the origin of New York, it was a fur trading for, like, you draw that innate first principles, and that's how you get what works in New York.
That's fascinating. Can I ask you about the term metacognition? Does it refer to within person metacognition about ecosystems, in the sense that, like, you will need to understand the principles of ecosystems and you'll need to kind of incorporate this into your reasoning? And or does it refer to between person cognition that becomes larger than the sum of its parts, in the sense that they're like emergent kind of principles and insights that come out of a group of people who are all kind of doing things together?
I think that's going to be part of the exploration of the Substack and I've got different things that I'm thinking about, and then the personas, the builders, storytellers, philosophers, the different models of Austin,
so cool.
These kind of first principles ideas. But I think it just is that, I think the meta part, right, is, for me, is it's more than just a collection, like everybody's here at this spot and this is the thing, right?
Yeah.
And that if you think about it as a builder, as a investor, as a whoever, then that probably will help with those outcomes.
Yeah. So
whether you want to build an ecosystem, whether you want to build a company, I think, because the underlying thesis is, if the first principles of an ecosystem, of an idea, of a founder, of the capital all line up, that's when you produce generational outcomes. And probably even when you think about back to some of the work that you're doing, there are probably, if you break, I would assume, based on our conversation about the video games, that you could probably there isn't one type of founder. And so they probably even alignment of founders into this same kind of thing. Like these, again, it is not, I was having a conversation with some of the guys from like the Gundo. It's not dogmatic. It's not like, if you're in AI, you have to be like, it's not solely of that kind of, you must do this kind of thing. But there are certain rhymes and to those kind to the ecosystems, and they change too, of course. Like we're talking about foundational AI. Who the hell was talking about that 10 years ago or whatever, right? And it'll be something different in 10 years. And so understanding that, I think, is something different. I've had people who were like, well, that's stupid. That doesn't make any sense, right? Like, just
Really?
put lots of smart people together, right? And that's all an ecosystem is.
No.
Like,
It's much more specific than that. I mean, I
right.
have so many intuitions about this that you're giving words to. So I'm so excited for your project and for our projects to complement each other, be their own emergent source of metacognition, if you will. But I mean, just as an example, I have had conversations with clients who are founders living in, I'll be very careful here not to identify anybody, but who are either vacillating about where to continue building, whether to move to SF or whether to stay in New York or whether to stay in, like London, which has its own draw for very different reasons for, any given founder. And I've had conversations more than once that amount to a mapping of the different mindsets, like mental modes that I've identified together with a founder. You've got this like scarcity mode and you've got this abundance mode. You've got this like positive sum mode, and then you have this like eat or be eaten mode that you get into, and you feel different feelings and interact differently with people, and you see different affordances in the world, and you derive energy from different things, if at all, when you're in these different modes. And we know that like there are some modes that usually I've got my kind of builder's mindset framework that describes in broad terms, like, here's the mode that best maps onto the high agency humanist kind of approach to life, that I'm really championing. And for a given founder, we've been able to map the city they live in, especially if they've experienced, for example, SF, New York, and a few other cities. Like, here's the philosophical orientation to life that I experience when I'm in this city, this city, this city. And like for a given founder, it's like when I'm in SF, like I just want to work, I just want to build. I'm in my kind of like scrappy, can do, it's all about innovation kind of mindset. And when I'm in New York, I'm in my let me prove how much money I can make and let me compare myself to people. And this is not universal by any means. This is like an interaction effect of like who the founder is, kind of what their demons are and what city they're in. But like
it kind of gets back to Paul Graham's Ambition in Cities thing about like what does each city call, is asking of you.
That's right. Yeah, and it's
but it doesn't
question even deeper than your industry, but I think that which I think matters. But it's like, what mindset do you need reinforced for you day to day, and what city is gonna be most conducive to that?
But then it doesn't necessarily, and this is part of the part where it doesn't mean that that ambition is negative to other cities. Like your description of SF was builder
for this particular founder. Like for other founders,
but I think it's funny because when I've talked about first principles of some of these ecosystems, I've tended to, and maybe it's part of, I've tended to talk more almost product oriented, like that. So like in the way I've described Austin a lot is like it's the physical meets the digital a lot with a creative aspect. I mean, so the ecosystem model that I use, like I said, I hate Silicon, XYZ, but it doesn't mean that you can't use other models. Mm-hmm. So the example I give here is I think that Austin, the way I describe it is it's modern Silicon Valley plus 1950s Detroit plus 1920s Paris.
Whoa.
So it's the digital, it's the industrial of 1950s Detroit, we building things, and then it's the creative intellectualism of the 1920s Paris. That's the convergence set.
I'm really glad I'm living here suddenly. Now I hear you say that.
And that's something very different, right? When you go back and look, and you could probably use other metrics as well, right? But so there's those models you can use, but that is wholly something different.
Yeah.
But some of those things they hold throughout time, just like SF has been something for a long time, and that's its modern incarnation. The same thing we were just saying with New York.
Yeah, I mean it has a gravity. Like I think the way from an individual psychological standpoint, the way that I think it's experienced is like there's a certain default gravity to this place. Like by default, unless I really consciously push back and override certain draws, or kind of certain default ways of being and seeing the world. Like the gravity of this place will pull me toward like wanting to build and innovate, or it'll pull me toward wanting to have deep conversations and, sip coffee while engaging in a salon, or it'll pull me
Right.
toward hustling to make a higher salary, or whatever it may be.
But is your point, like there's a psychological element to it that needs to probably get described better. I know some of the people were talking about like it's the cowboys meet the hippies and the techno futurists. That's Caitlin from Avalanche VC, described it that way. And I know other people. It was, I think, Willie Nelson's song was the hippies and the cowboys. Like I think that might be missing from my model. Is your point? Like there's a mindset culture that's missing from the technological product side of it.
Yeah, but I'm sure is tightly interwoven with it in really interesting ways that would be missing from my model because I haven't been thinking about it at this ecosystem level as much. Like I really think about it from the individual level. So I feel like our models together are going to add up to a really valuable set of heuristics for people to decide where they want to live and what life they want to build.
Right. I mean, it's an interesting thing because you keep seeing like on these, I'll be listening to like various podcasts, and I keep joking with Jim O'Shaughnessy, like how many like of his guests I keep stealing,
Poacher.
Yourself included, is that you keep they're like, oh, and this person's in Austin and that person's in Austin, and like you just kind of see these interesting groups that are all kind of coming here, both loudly and not loudly. And you kind of ask like, okay, so what is it that is attracting from a mindset? Your point, like, is it a mindset because you have gigantic builders to thinkers to different types of people, and it's not for lack of ambition. The projects are all very, very different.
Yeah.
But there seems to be, when we say that people are coming to Austin for Austin, not for this narrative or that particular narrative, but there seems to be something underlying that is the attractive force, and that's almost that mindset, that particular culture, that zeitgeist that is the thing, the unspoken thing that is the gravity, as you said.
Yeah, I mean, this is where I think there are really interesting intersections with our first topic, which was agency. Because when I think about and this is where you'll probably have a lot more of the relevant like historical examples of how does an ecosystem, like what are the attractors, what are the kind of crucial nodes in the network that then have these kind of exponential ripple effects on the rest of the network where, oh wow, like the character of this city changed over 5 years, over 10 years because, I don't know, Paul Graham came and started YC or because of XYZ developments.
Right.
And when I think about like the interaction between the people coming in to Austin, let's say people who come to Austin for Austin, or as in my case, for much more, almost call them transactional reasons. Like we didn't necessarily already have a love for Austin. We came because a bunch of our friends had moved here and we wanted a second kid. And we had all these, friends who had their own young children that we could create a pod with. And there were schools and, a bunch of stuff converged. And I got a really nice job at UT Austin. And now that I'm here, I have a lot of choices around, well, how much do I actually try to understand and take advantage of this city? And a lot of what you're saying is reminding, like, I have not taken advantage of Austin and I have not really sufficiently kind of embedded myself. And I want to, like, that's a New Year's resolution that I'm forming on the spot, to do more of. But I think so much of agency, like when I think about that variable and the difference that it makes both to someone's experience of that ecosystem, like the extent to which someone actually gets activated by that kind of mixture of industry and kind of virtual connectedness and innovation and like creative intellectual energy, like to the extent to which someone notices and catches that wave and actually rises to its occasion, so to speak. And then also the extent to which someone shapes it. Like, okay, I really like the French which century, like I really like this kind of Enlightenment feel and I really like it, but I don't like that there's this kind of like anti-tech sentiment in these kind of more academic circles. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my capital, or I'm going to use my charisma and my networking skills to really double down on the kind of, enlightenment aspect, and just kind of like bleed dry the anti-tech aspect. And I'm going to think strategically about who do I want to invite, and I'm going to invite the smartest people from academia to come and like drink in, the nectar of progress and kind of creative, innovative thinking. And then they're going to go and have events at the campus. And then like someone can really quickly shift things and, push things forward if A, they're high agency, and B, they're into ecosystem design, right? Like, which I'm not. I'm high agency, but not about that, right? Like that's not one of my chosen spheres of influence.
Yeah, and it's one of the big questions I have is you said ecosystem design is, can you even, like, I think that's the big thing when you're at this point in the underlying question that I'm asking, and a lot of this is the evolution of Austin from a thriving to a superstar, and I think part of it is get out of the way, and I think that's the hardest thing for a lot is early in. It's from X to Y in the growth. It is you build it and they will come. Like, you have to build that first place, and then the next phase is is let the builders do. But then there are other pieces that have to happen. But it's not like we will make this happen. Like, no, anyone that's saying we will make it happen is probably not the ones actually making it happen.
That's a really
to your point about like with like YC being so involved in that. YC built and did something. It wasn't like we're going to make YC happen, and this no.
It's a really good error mode that I've seen any number of times where someone thinks, well, we will build the center, and then like not think about, okay, well, who are we going to actually bring in to run the center, and what is the center going to do? Like to your point of like, what are we actually going to be building? Are we going to be running events? Or like, what are we going to be? It's like, no, it will be a pro whatever. Insert cause here, center. Like, nobody's going to come to your center. Why should they? For what? And have you considered how you're actually going to attract the really smart people who are then going to actually, infuse new thinking into your center? And what are they coming for? Just to hang out? They're busy people. Yeah. Like, you've got to actually, I'll be offering something. Yeah.
It only works when when like Brad Feld talks about it, like in the startup communities, when the actual builders are doing it, because then it's like, oh, well, I need this, so I'll build the center because I need this, so we're going to do this to be created, right?
That's right.
Not if I build it, something magic's going to happen.
Right. Yeah, that is just generally a recipe for inertia and failure, I have found.
So I think this is the perfect place to end with always the same question then, especially with your New Year's resolution. So then what's next, Austin?
Oof. I mean, I can tell you what's next for me in Austin.
It's good. It's always open-ended in any way you want to answer the question.
Yeah. I mean, I want to actually get out of my house where I have my, cushy home office and meet a lot more people like you more regularly, and really, if not shape the ecosystem, because again, that would not be one of my superpowers, and it would be a misuse of my time to try to like really index on that as a goal in its own right, but to really leverage the ecosystem, to really participate in the ecosystem much more actively. And I think that partly means that some of my clients come out of Austin. I've generally kind of defaulted to working with a lot of, because I'm all remote, all my clients are see me through Zoom. Most of my clients are either in Silicon Valley, or they're in New York, or they're in various places around the world. And sometimes there's a client here or there who's in Austin. I think I have maybe one or two right now who happen to be in Austin. I'm not doing enough to really leverage the local ecosystem that you're really reminding me matters. And I think generally I neglect to think about ecosystem effects. I think it's something I've just never been as sharply aware of, or I don't have a kind of practice of indexing on it and looking for it and participating in it. And when I was in SF over the summer, there were all kinds of things that I noticed, both about, like the gravity here, it like pulls me toward going to certain kinds of networking events. It pulls me toward doubling down on building projects. But also I noticed like it doesn't happen by itself. Like I still need to seek out the right events, or I'll end up at a bunch of really crappy low leverage events and get stuck in local minima unless I actually think in an intentional, strategic way about where do I most want to be and what am I trying to achieve with my social schedule while I'm here. And I think the same thing applies to Austin, where I don't have this really limited window like I did in SF, where only so much could really happen in those couple months. I live here and I'm guessing I'm not alone among all these various imports from New York SF. We came from New York, 2.5 years ago. And it was we were in a mindset of, we're kind of like hibernating to Austin because the friends of our friends with children are here, but not sufficiently in a mindset of we're moving to an up and coming entrepreneurial hub and cultural hub. And I think really embracing Austin as this up and coming, entrepreneurial cultural hub and participating in that evolution is something that I'm now way more excited about than I even was before the start of this call. So I'll be seeing more of you in the coming year, Jason, and I'm excited for it.
So what's next, Austin? We're glad you've joined us on this journey. Please subscribe at your favorite podcast catcher, leave us a review, and let your colleagues know about us. This will help us grow the podcast and continue bringing you unique interviews and insights. Thanks again for listening, and see you soon.